Well, I hope everyone is doing well. Summer is unfortunately ending faster than I think anyone in school would like, right? Probably parents are a little more pleased. It's like, okay. So this morning, several of our passages, certainly Psalm 23, the stillness of the waters, the walking through the valley of the shadow of death, but fearing no evil. That passage talks about this idea of God granting somehow a freedom from fear, that fear can be cast out, that it can be banished and done away with. And Ephesians, our Ephesians reading about Christ creating peace, bringing together those who had ancient enmities, the Jews and the Greeks, somehow finding a common unity in Christ. And certainly this passage from Jeremiah, where it talks about kind of a vision for the Messianic kingdom. Jeremiah could see that a day was coming when, despite the experience of Israel with their poor shepherds, and this is about 600 years before Jesus is born, that those who were leading Israel had done a horrible job and had not really tended to the people. And yet Jeremiah could say, a day is coming when Israel will dwell in safety, in peace. There won't be this kind of fear anymore. And that ultimately God would raise up this righteous branch of David, an allusion to the Messiah, and that there would be this freedom from fear. So I set myself the task of saying, let's talk about how these passages point us towards casting out fear, getting rid of fear. Um, and the more I've thought about it this week, the more daunting that task has become as I really thought about, well, what does that actually mean? It's easy to say, what does it mean in a kind of practical way? See, it's easy to preach a sermon, which would be a classic sermon. And I don't tend to preach sermons. I tend to share meditations to get us to think, right? It's an intentional choice of language there. This is a meditation for which we are to engage an opportunity to think, to ponder, and to go away, even continuing to process. But it'd be easy to preach a sermon about how God has set us free from fear and everyone feels great. And then Monday morning comes and business isn't good and they're starting to downsize at work and there's rumblings about, maybe profits are down and you're wondering, well, what about my job? Is it secure? Or there's a relational issue going on and you're like, I'm concerned about my relationship with a friend or a family member, and that's kind of rocky, and I don't know where that's going to go and how that's going to turn out. Or there's health issues, or there's climate change, or there's politics. Or, our world is filled with lots of opportunities to be afraid. It is a target-rich environment, right? You know, and there's lots of things that can trigger fear, and those are very real. And so we can have a rousing Sunday sermon about we don't need to fear. And then life, how am I going to pay the bills? How am I going to do these things? What's going to happen next? All of that impacts us, and the sermon doesn't seem to help. So I don't want to preach a sermon about no need to fear, but I do want us to think about the topic to somehow do justice to the text that we've looked at, particularly this text, Jeremiah 23, and about also do justice to our lived realities, not to pretend that somehow it's different or it's easy. So let me try and do that. I'm certainly glad this is not some sort of seminar where you paid money because you'd be asking for it back afterwards. You'd be like, he promised, and now I want my money back. So it's free. So if it doesn't deliver well, you got what you paid for, right? I did like this picture. I found this picture. I was looking for pictures that someone had a hand up and stop. And I was actually thinking it would be kind of the back of a person, with a stop towards something in the, distance. But I found this one and I thought, well, that kind of captures it. It's almost a picture of a somewhat fearful person trying to ward off fear. And then I noticed that on her ring finger, there's this tattoo of a heart. And I didn't realize that till later. like days later after I'd chosen the picture, and I thought, well, now the picture really works because that little tattoo of the heart on her underside of her ring finger is somehow part of the message. All right, so let's look at the text a little bit, see what we can do with it. So I said this is, 600 years before Jesus. Jeremiah is writing when the enemy is at the gates. Judah is going to fall to the Babylonians for a lot of political reasons and a lot of other dumb things they've done. And a lot of it political, but the prophets also tend to set it in the context of saying, but it's also due to our unfaithfulness to God. And there's truth to that because a lot of the things the kings had done previously with making alliances were out of trying to manipulate the powers that be. And when they did that, sometimes they chose poorly and they angered an empire. And empires, when emperors get angry, lots of times they come to settle the score. And so that's what's happening to Judah. And Jeremiah is saying, well, the leaders have done a poor job. The people have not been tended. I think it's interesting in verse 2 because the way I want to read it is a way I think is inconsistent with God. But it's the way I would have read it for so long. God speaking to these leaders says, you have scattered my flock and driven them away and have not attended to them. Behold, I am about to attend to you. And the way I would read that is, you have not lovingly nurtured the people, so I'm going to really, come harshly and punish you. Same word attend both times, but I read them with opposite meanings because I assume that God's attending to the leaders will be vindictive, retribution. What if it's actually the attending to them that he wanted them to do for the people? What if God is saying, I need to come nurture and train and teach you guys because obviously you didn't know how to nurture, train, and take care of people, which is actually, I think, much more consistent with the God I believe in, is his attending to the shepherds is for their reformation of heart and soul, mind, and self, because they're not in a good place. They don't know how to be leaders. And so God's coming to attend to them with the same kind of selfless interest for their good that he wanted them to show to the people. I don't know. Now that's how I read it, right? It's not a threat. It is, though, something that they're going to find difficult because what he wants to train them to be is at odds with who they are. And that is always an unpleasant experience. Not because God is trying to be harsh and mean, but because if I am so out of step with the way God is, then coming into the presence of perfect love might be extremely painful because all I know is selfish love. And what I'm encountering is the need for selfless love. And I'm having to let go of all my own agendas and my desires and the way I want things to be. And it's hard for me to let go of what I want. So anyway, maybe verse 2 is not God promising some sort of harshness, vengeance, but really, I need to do something for you because obviously you don't know how to attend to others. But then, interestingly enough, verse 3 is a theme I find in other places in the prophets, where Jeremiah says, speaking as God, then I myself will gather the remnant of my flock. And this is a prophetic theme that God acts unilaterally for the good. I mean, I kind of grew up lots of times with a message that God is depending on us. Like we're the only, especially in missions, and I was in missions, we're the only hands and feet God has. Like if we don't come through for God, the whole thing is going to fall apart. Like you are carrying this burden of taking the gospel to the world and saving all the lost, because if you don't, it won't happen. God has decided to put all his eggs in your basket, which would mean God is not very smart, but it was still what we were told was happening. But the prophets never say that. They say, look, when God can't find anyone to do it, he does it himself, all by himself. He does what needs to be done. The same thing is said in Isaiah 59, verse 16. It says, speaking of God, he saw that there was no man. He was amazed that there was no one interceding. So his own arm brought salvation, and his own righteousness supported him. And he goes on to describe God kind of dressing himself as a warrior, putting on his armor, which then makes me think, I think that's what Paul's alluding to in Ephesians chapter 6 about putting on the whole armor of God. That the picture is God is doing this with or without us. Now, he'd love to do it with us and for us to enjoy the process of doing good things with him, but he's not dependent on me. It's like when my when my children were small, sometimes I would have my son help me, which usually meant the project took longer, right? I mean, I could have done it more efficiently had I just said, Aaron, you go play, I'll do this. But I enjoyed having him do it with me, even though that meant a more laborious sort of procedure, and I had to help him, and maybe he'd make a mistake, and we'd have to fix it. But there was a kind of pleasure in my son doing something with me. I think that's where God is with us. He wants us to enjoy working with him because it benefits us, and he gets great pleasure in seeing us participate, but we're not needed. So here's God acting on his own, and he's going to gather his people. He's going to establish them in this place, verse 4, where they are no longer afraid, nor terrified, nor will there be any missing. I love that part. He's not going to be like, oops, I didn't get some. I got them all. I got all of them. And I brought them all in. And I'm taking care of all of them. Verse 5 and 6, then, kind of the messianic vision, the promise of Jesus. Okay, so that's what the text presents to us. So what does this look like then, this promise of peace, this promise of no fear? That through Christ, and that's what Jeremiah is alluding to, is that one day this Messiah will come, that in this dawning age, when this will happen, then they will dwell in safety, because God will have acted on his own, unilaterally. While we were yet enemies, Christ died for us, will be the way Paul says it. He acted on his own to establish a kind of peace. And as we read in Ephesians 2 this morning, and through Christ, God is uniting humanity and taking down old divisions and things that stood between us historically and culturally. You could say racially, right? Ideologically. He's tearing all that down in the cross, creating a new humanity. So if all this is happening, and it creates a kind of space where there is no fear, what does it mean for us then to experience that? Because my lived reality is often at odds with that kind of promise. Well, what I don't think we do is just believe what he's saying all the more harder. Like, just really believe it, right? Like, the reason I'm not experiencing this kind of peace and serenity in my life and sense of security, but I'm filled with fear, is because I just don't believe the message enough. I don't think we just have to believe it more. I think we have to do something. Because I entitled these thoughts Banishing Fear, but the question is, who's going to do the banishing? Well, if I understand that it means God's going to do the banishing, then I just wait on the Lord. Let's just pray and wait and believe and hope. And maybe I'll wake up Monday morning and I won't be afraid. When I think realistically about my experience and the way life comes at me, that's not going to happen, never has, probably never will. that I have to take some personal ownership in this banishing of fear. Now, what's God doing? God is providing for me promises and a space. What I have to do is I have to do something metaphorically to live in that space. And that's my part. So I'm not going to live without fear while every day doom scrolling through social media. You know what doom scrolling is, right? If you don't, I'm not going to bother to explain it. It communicated to some people, right? Doom scrolling through social media. If I'm doing that every day, I'm not going to experience some absence of fear because God is not going to somehow like tear the device out of my hand, make me stop taking all of that in and orienting myself towards all this fearfulness. Like feeling like my life doesn't matter and I'm not good enough and look at all these other people and what they're experiencing, and just sinking deeper and deeper into a bad space. Because I don't think what God is doing is I'm going to banish fear whether you like it or not. Like I'm going to rid you of fear while you try and do everything to heighten the fear in your own life. Now, maybe you don't think you are, but if I'm doing the things that are cultivating fear, then I don't think I need to turn around and blame God that fear's here and he promised it wouldn't be. Like I have to do something in accordance with what I have been told if I want to be rid of this fear and not live in it. Now, again, what I don't think is possible is that I will be rid of things that can generate fear, like those things occurring, coming to me uninvited. Those guests that you don't really want, but they show up at the party anyway. To me, Jesus says it that way when he talks about each day has enough trouble of its own. He doesn't say there's a way to have days where there is no trouble every single day. No, there's trouble. Those are the uninvited guests who show up in your day. But part of what he's saying is you just handle what is happening right now that you actually have to deal with. So this living without fear doesn't mean there won't be things that could arouse fear in me, that come, that occur, that are in the world, that are in my life. But it seems to me that I have to be actively cultivating a kind of place with the Lord, with Christ, that pushes back when these things come up, because they will. Maybe a way to put it here out of Jeremiah is God is promising a shepherd. The question for me is, but am I listening to my shepherd? Because it's kind of like if you're doom scrolling social media, or if you've got the 24/7 news channels on all the time. It's probably been 15 years since I've watched broadcast news. I don't think I've missed anything. Not a bit. I mean, I look through, news in terms of headlines. The way I say it is, I want to know if there's been an earthquake in Peru so I can pray, right? I don't want to be ignorant, but I don't need everybody's talk show take on things and their version of it and what they're trying to do, right? Getting me to be afraid so I can join their team, right? The reality is I'm choosing shepherds all the time. And if I choose shepherds who fearmonger, I am going to be fearful. But I've got a shepherd who will lead me by still waters, who will help me when the valley's dark and the shadow looks like of death itself. But the question is, am I listening to that shepherd? Is that shepherd the one who dominates what I take in? And here's where it becomes my responsibility. Like, I have to take responsibility for my own fear. If there's lots of fear in my life, I have to ask myself, where have I been cultivating that and allowing that to be there? I can't stop the fact that it shows up, because when you get a bad diagnosis, when a problem happens, when business isn't going well, when those kinds of things happen. But I can make personal decisions, and I'm hoping that this is a kind of empowering talk that's almost over. um, but it's empowering in the sense that it's saying you can do something. You are not here as a complete victim of the powers that be out there in the world. No, I can take ownership for what I allow to live in my thoughts and in my head and in my heart. And there is a loving God who wants to lead me in another path and find a way to live free of all of that. And it's not a modern phenomenon. I think if you're living at the fall of Rome when the Germanic tribes are assaulting the city, I think there's some existential fear, right? It's not new that right now in human history, we have lots of things to be afraid of. There's always been lots of things to be afraid of, right? But the question is, who's my shepherd? So if I'm choosing shepherds in media, in news, if I'm choosing these people and saying, I'm going to let these people shepherd me, they're going to shepherd you somewhere all right. And I think you're going to find yourself fearful, and fearful of others, because the others are always the problem, right? Whoever the others are going to be today, tomorrow. Used to be communists were the others we were most afraid of. Yep. We used to do those drills in school, get under the desk, kind of the nuclear attack drill. We were afraid of the communists. Not so much anymore, right? We're afraid of other people. So what this comes down to then, to me, is yes, I have to take ownership in my own life about my fear problems. God is providing for me. If I listen carefully to Jesus, he is telling me how I can live. Each day has enough trouble of its own. Just take it one day at a time. Remember that Jesus is on the throne. Know that suffering happens, but suffering never gets the final word. I mean, all of this Jesus is teaching me, telling me through the examples of his own life, through what he taught. But I have to attend to him like he is attending to me. It's a two-way street. But if I do, if I tamp down the voices that want to, for their own ends, get me to be afraid, I can find that life can be more peaceful and the waters can be still in many ways. But I have to spend time with Jesus for that to be a reality. So our prayer then can be, Lord, let me spend time with you. Lead me by the still waters. You lead me there. You want to help me to want to follow you to where the waters are still. To spend a little time in silence and reflection and to remember life is good. God is loving, and this too will pass. It always does. May this be how God leads us from fear.